Foreign investment is a cornerstone for governments and corporations around the world. It's like an infinity stone or a shooting star that every nation is in dire need of. The possibilities are just immeasurable. Ah, yes, the economic growth, the job creation, and the technological advancements. But what if I told you there's so much more to it? What if I told you that as a country, you may have extremely cheap labor and attractive features for investors? However, it may still not be enough for large companies to set up their operations in your country. Odd, isn't it? Having everything they look for but still not being worthy? Let's talk about that. Ireland is a sovereign nation that is home to over 5 million people who are all quickly becoming wealthy citizens. The degree of their wealth could be some of the highest in the world, with a GDP per capita of over $90,000. They're far better than traditionally wealthy nations in regions like Switzerland, Hong Kong, and Norway. Interestingly, Ireland is only placed behind statistical outliers like Qatar, Luxembourg, and Singapore. Now, all of this may seem impressive, as it is, but what's more impressive is that Ireland was well on track to become the fastest growing economy in 2020, considering 2020 was a year that caused most nations to fall behind. However, Ireland continued to persevere despite being heavily dependent on trade and tourism. Enjoying this video so far? Please don't forget to subscribe and press the bell icon to receive notifications about our latest uploads. Thanks. Now let's get back to the video. Now, thinking about 2020, all that comes to mind are lockdowns, chaos, shortages, and quarantines. But what did Ireland do? What can we learn from Ireland's economy? What can we adopt from Ireland's policies and methods to apply it to our economy as well? Like always, the answer is more complicated than it seems. While Ireland dishes out incredible numbers in its GDP, it clearly does not tell the whole story. We can't just rely on GDP metrics alone to help us evaluate a nation's economy. It doesn't tell us the true prosperity of a nation and the people that live in it. So, how do we evaluate Ireland's success? Well, we need to look much deeper, and we need to ask the right questions, such as, how has Ireland become so wealthy despite being a repressed nation for most of its history? How does Ireland's wealth benefit its citizens? What should we adopt from their success? And can it work with every nation? Keep watching the video if you want the answers to these questions. Ireland is a member of the European Union, and unlike England, they have no intentions of leaving the European Union anytime soon. The relationship Ireland has with the European Union has been significantly monumental in its own way. We could agree that the Irish relation with the European Union has made the country what it is today. However, all that glitters isn't gold. While the relationship has innumerable benefits, Ireland still suffers from many drawbacks. For starters, Ireland's use of the euro is more harmful than beneficial. Ireland's lack of control over its currency simply means that it can't set its own interest rates, and they're responsible for underdeveloped and underperforming regions in the Union. The lack of autonomy that comes with adopting the euro simply means that countries who want to adopt newer economic policies can be barred from doing so. This lack of autonomy is the core reason why most European regions have failed to project higher GDP growth in the last decade. Nations like Germany have to suffer because of underperforming European regions that project unsatisfactory results. Consequently, underperforming nations are stepped on by overperforming nations. Despite the nature of this back and forth swing, Ireland has managed to double in size in the same decade as most European regions went nowhere. So, what did Ireland do? They generated money. There's an amusing term called the double Irish with a Dutch sandwich. While some people may drool over this term thinking it's a satiating meal, the reality is something completely different. The double Irish with a Dutch sandwich is a term used to depict an intricate tax loophole where international corporations like Apple, Google, and more can exploit intellectual property and corporate expense laws via Ireland and the Netherlands, using this loophole to hoard massive piles of cash without paying any tax. Trillions of dollars from major companies have been parked in, you guessed it, Ireland. Oh, so that's how Ireland's so wealthy. Well, no. This just scratches the surface. You might think that trillions of foreign investment dollars sounds excellent, and may answer how Ireland got so rich. However, there are two problems. The first problem is that, while all of this is true, it only existed a while ago, as it doesn't exist anymore today. Interestingly, the loophole that made the whole double Irish with a Dutch sandwich term was closed by Irish law in 2015, which essentially meant that no new corporate structures could have been set up. Moreover, the existing corporate structures had until 2020 to make amendments. Since we've already crossed 2020, there's no more double Irish. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that the money is gone. Interestingly enough, in the 2 decades that significant companies exploited this loophole, the corporations involved stacked up trillions of dollars in Ireland, which later caused another problem. While large companies stacked up trillions of dollars across Irish accounts, it didn't necessarily benefit Ireland. We can agree that the whole reason these companies chose Ireland for their business was essentially legal tax evasion. They didn't have to pay billions, if not trillions of dollars in taxes. Enjoying the video? Remember to hit that like and subscribe button. Thanks! Now, suppose the country switched and started taxing the income to benefit public services. Well, in that case, we know these companies would just go and find themselves an alternative in a more facilitating country. To provide those services, Ireland had a select few very well-paid accountants and lawyers, which could potentially benefit Ireland, but it didn't necessarily mean that you and I could benefit. Surprisingly, Ireland had a plan. You see, the Irish law knew that these companies would bail on them as soon as they closed the loophole. They predicted that the companies would try their hardest to route back the money to the United States for reinvestment, dividend, or stock buybacks as soon as they closed it. Well, that's what happened. Companies tried, but Ireland prevailed. The Irish imposed a law that if these companies were to reroute their money, they would need to count it as income and pay tax. Ireland's forward thinking allowed them to save money tax-free and lock the money within Irish territories. Ireland allowed those companies to use their trillions within Ireland without any significant penalties. Since the money couldn't leave the country, the companies had no choice but to invest in research and development, which would develop their operations worldwide. And Ireland got more jobs and investments into their local economy. On the other hand, the companies involved got to do something with their money in a relatively business-friendly environment. Today, Ireland has developed into the largest technological center globally, with operations from silicon chip manufacturing to medical research centers catering to a population of barely 5 million people. One main reason why large companies set up operations here in Ireland, instead of Silicon Valley or Seattle or Shenzhen, is not limited to tax. Instead, it's that Ireland is a highly efficient mediator. Let's take an example from Ireland's Shannon International Airport. Now, the Shannon International Airport might not be the most dazzling airport in the world, like Dubai Airport. However, there's a lot more to it. Now, outside the Shannon International Airport is the Shannon Free Trade Zone. A free trade zone was established back in 1959 as a way to welcome businesses to set up operations in the country. Before this, Ireland really struggled to attract international investment because it had a bad rep for being extremely unstable. And the country's fight for independence only added to their bad rep for being extremely unstable. Speculation around Ireland weren't, let's say, inviting. However, this free trade zone was something that countered those speculations rather well. The Shannon Free Trade Zone was something to be excited about for the Irish. What it did was set up almost 600 acres of land around the airport as a business park where local import, export, or business taxes did not need to be paid until the goods left the boundary. This meant that large companies could set up their manufacturing centers in this little area, fly in parts, and fly out final products without paying hefty tariffs that were common in other countries. Now, you might think that Ireland is just full of loopholes. No wonder why it's so rich. However, it isn't exactly a loophole. Let me explain why. The companies that set up their operations in Ireland still had to pay taxes in other countries where they sold their products, making Ireland the world's first and largest airport duty-free zone. This strategy, mixed with Ireland's strong policies on intellectual property rights, welcomed companies like Intel, Lufthansa, De Beers, and GE Capital Aviation Services. As a matter of fact, Sony's first international manufacturing operation was set up in Shannon, Ireland of all places. Technically, at the time, any country could have pulled what Ireland pulled. However, it wouldn't have been as popular as Ireland, since the nation wasn't just limited to its duty-free zone in Shannon, mainly because Ireland was in a perfect location for operations between Europe and the United States, the two largest industrial centers in the world at the time. Moreover, it also offered a sneaky portal into the European economic community for American companies that generally had to pay large markups on imports into this exclusive European club. What's more is that Ireland was home to an English-speaking population that was literate and very well educated. While being able to manufacture silicone chips without paying taxes was all well and good, it wasn't a job for anyone to partake in, which is why good education was so important. This entire system surged the local economy, brought businesses into an ordinary airport, and created highly skilled, high-paying jobs in the Irish economy that were essentially paid for by companies abroad. While all of this may sound very attractive and perfect, it doesn't mean that it is perfect. First off, this whole system was highly dependent on an airport. Now, research suggests that most international trade is made using ships instead of aircraft because they're cheaper to operate on a larger scale. This means that Ireland could only attract companies that relied on manufacturing very small, high-value products like computer components, diamonds, and aircraft parts. While this may have been limiting, with Ireland's modest and educated population, we could agree that this was more of a feature than a bug. Even if they did have access to large-scale shipping, we know that low-cost manufacturing just wasn't going to be their thing. Now, another problem with Ireland's system is that it is outdated. It wouldn't apply today. Before trade deals, and in a time of extensive import and export tariffs, this free trade zone was an effective strategy that most companies could have used. However, today it is somewhat ineffective. Interestingly, the Shannon Free Trade Zone lost most of its special privileges in early 2003. However, despite being yet another industrial center outside an airport, it is home to over 100 international firms that employs over 10,000 workers, with thousands more throughout the country. Fundamentally, this is what has given the nation such great metrics. Companies just decided to stick with it because they've been there for so long. Ireland may not have the same sparkle that it had years ago. Global tax loopholes have long closed, and free trade zones are basically irrelevant. While its domestic tax rates are low, we can agree that there are cheaper alternatives. The critical factor that has made Ireland so successful is that there are no other more attractive options that would make it worth shifting the large infrastructures out of the country. It's the same way Hollywood is the go-to place for making movies. Ireland is the go-to place for financial services and technological development because it's home to all of these companies and people that are related to this stuff. For a more practical example, let's take General Electric Capital Services, or GCAS for short. As a prime example, GCAS is a rental service for airplanes. It generally buys planes from Airbus and Boeing and puts those up for rent to airlines worldwide who don't want to pay large amounts of money for an airplane. Now, GCAS is a vast company. It owns more planes than United, Delta, American Airlines, and Emirates combined. So, how is this connected to Ireland? Well, back when Shannon International Airport's free trade zone was still relevant, it was the only logical headquarters for GCAS global operation. This is because GCAS was buying up planes from both Airbus in Europe and Boeing in America, and then renting them out to airlines worldwide. While GCAS could do this from anywhere in the world, it had already established itself in Ireland. Now, you might be wondering if the presence of these large foreign companies benefit the Irish population. And the answer depends. The people directly involved in these multinational operations may benefit more than others. They certainly earn a lot more than everyone else and are very well off financially. However, everyone else suffers from technically the same problems that we see in other places driven by foreign investment. Problems like high rents and making average workers in traditional roles irrelevant. This is a rising problem that Ireland has to address, or it might face similar issues as other industry centers around the world, a two-speed economy. What do you think? How will Ireland solve its rising issues? Share your thoughts with us down below, and until then, I'll see you in the next video.